well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, listening, watching. We're in our final session of this two-day seminar on the new diplomacy. And it's been a very interesting 2 days, starting with a massive provocation from Kishore Mahbubani. You'd expect nothing less from Kishore, but his opening sentence was about what he called the G7 circus, representing 12% of the world, and who do they think they are? And we've gone through from that beginning through some quite interesting technical and special sessions, one on trade and finance, which was excellent. Very interesting session on the need for women-led diplomacy, as well as issues of culture, energy, science diplomacy. And it brings us, in our last session with Gideon Rachman and Bruno Macaz on cultural diplomacy. And it brings us to this last session. And it's got a kind of a tentative title built around the future of multilateral diplomacy. And there's two reasons for this. One of them is a massively selfish reason. I've just finished a book on can we save multilateralism and reset the world order. And so I was driven by that personally. But secondly, it struck me that it is the big ticket item. I mean, how do we go about restructuring world order, and what role does diplomacy have in it? When the big issues, the big ticket issues, are all issues, particularly things like health and pandemics, as we have Clare here with us, that in the long run, you're not going to deal with them satisfactorily in the absence of collective action problem solving. These are essentially transnational problems, not things that can be solved by reassertions of sovereignty and national resilience alone. So we are in a really big time. I mean, there's this question that is, I mean, you've seen it in lots of literature, whether COVID represents a turning point in international relations. And there's three views, there's more than three views, but there's a complacent view that really, no, it doesn't, and it's more of the same. And it's just another crisis and we'll muddle through to those who see it as apocalyptic and destined to bring about fundamental change. And the reason I've got this panel with the four speakers on is because you all fall, if I may make this comment without offending my speakers before they've said a word, you all fall into what I would call revisionist categories. Revisionist in the sense of you look for solutions to problems through multilateralism, through regionalism, through collective action problem solving, rather than are either complacent on the one hand or apocalyptic on the other. So that's the reason I put together this panel. And so I want to start, first of all, with Andy Cooper. And I also have to declare to the people who are listening that some of us, I think it's fair to say, are well known to each other. Andy and I have known each other for over 30 years, and we've written together, and Mills and I are very well known to each other, and Amitav and I are very well known to each other. But they all, in their own way, have made very special contributions in their areas. Clare joins us as a specialist in, I'm going to say health policy and global health policy, but is clearly making quite an impact on the debate in the work that she's written recently. So I think we've got an excellent panel. So we'll start with Andy Cooper, who is a research professor at Waterloo University and has published incredibly widely on diplomacy, including, and he'll be really irritated with me for mentioning this, but including one book on celebrity diplomacy, where he interviewed people like Bono and Mia Farrow and and wrote about their role in diplomacy. But more seriously, of course, he's one of the editors of the most widely used handbook of diplomacy, the Oxford Handbook of Diplomacy. Sarah will speak second. Sarah is in the London School of Economics, and she was telling us before we started that it's rather nice being an international relations specialist, but not being in the international relations department, because it gives her product differentiation over her colleagues and allows her to dodge things when it gets too technical for her, maybe. So we'll be second. Clare will be the second speaker. The third speaker will be Mills, Soko, who is a professor in the Witwatersrand Business School. And Mills has a PhD on, one of the first African PhDs on the World Trade Organization. So he has a very good regional political economy expertise. And instead of starting with Amitav, I plan to start with Amitav and finish with Andy. But we're going to start with Andy and we'll finish it with Amitav Acharya, who will be well known to many of our audience for his work on what he calls a multiplex world order and alternatives to mainstream international relations strategy. So without more ado, let me invite Andy Cooper to speak to us. Andy.
Richard, thank you. And thank you to the Brussels School of Governance. This is a wonderful time to be talking about diplomacy and multilateralism. It's a wonderful time to reconnect with Richard and Mills, and of course to meet Clare, and soon, well, I presume, meet Amitav again. Given that we had an eminent columnist from the Financial Times in the previous, I thought I would sort of start off with a kind of a mantra from the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago, that we're all multilateralists now. And if that's the case, to use the health analogy, there's a lot of variants out there of multilateralism and a lot of contestation. Richard, when he kindly invited me to this panel, suggested I talk on 2 or 3 themes. So of course I've taken 3 themes, and 3 themes of contestation that I see in the world of multilateralism or multilateralisms. The first, and I'm sure Clare is going to be talking about this, is the world of formal multilateralism, particularly treaty-based, charter-based. We're going to find that this is the most normatively attractive form of multilateralism. But at the same time, it's awfully difficult. I think there's probably Clare again will talk about the difficulties of working in the health field, but one can see, even if it's difficult, not impossible. And here we can go back to the multilateralism around environment, around climate change. And we see the huge progress of the COP process, COP26 coming into Glasgow in November. But at the same time, if we connect this to multilateralism and to diplomacy, what are the trends that we see? We see, in a sense, a countervailing view that type of formal multilateralism has got too big. The kind of word is jamboree diplomacy. Everybody's involved. And of course, going back to some of the COP processes and meetings and summits, we can see that that's very much true. 20,000, 30,000 actors, people, individuals meeting at COP. So again, there's going to be some sort of pushback on efficiency, moving back to much more technical diplomacy, particularly in the implementation stage. This is an interesting feature because probably many years ago, we wouldn't have envisaged this. We would have seen that more is the better, looking at the summits around human rights, around women's rights, around habitat, all sorts of different areas, domains outside of summit diplomacy. This is the first theme, probably, or the first domain. It's probably the one I know. You know, I've worked on summits through the UN, but probably it's not the area that I've been working on now. The second, and I presume Mills will work on this, is the sense of the other. And this is the ascendant form of multilateralism, competitive multilateralism, geopolitical multilateralism. And it's got a sense of polarization. One of the themes of this event is binary, and we see there's a sort of binary between China and the United States, but also the form of diplomacy. Here, of course, wolf warrior diplomacy jumps out, right? And what is interesting over the last few weeks, even whatever you think of the G7, the response of China, we see the multilateralism of wolf warrior diplomacy. Up until that point, we see that wolf warrior diplomacy is deployed pretty much on a bilateral basis, focusing on different countries, bilateral sort of targeting. Now we're seeing that wolf warrior diplomacy, again, for better or worse, is focused on particularly the G7. And also the binary nature of organizations, NATO versus the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, not the best known organization, but it's been in existence. It's just gone through an anniversary, 20 years. So this shows a staying power. And what is really interesting, the binary nature of the G7 back to the Belt and Road. The sense that even though in the past we see the BRIC countries focusing on the G7 and the G20, now we're seeing the G7 focusing on the Belt and Road, trying to raise their game, trying to mobilize new types of actors and new types of resources for that type of diplomacy. There's going to be pressures here, and I think my sense of what sort of diplomatic implications, if you take away the wolf warrior side, the kind of conflictual, it's looking for kind of straddler countries, looking for countries that straddle China and the United States. Here, there's going to be a lot of small countries that come into play. We see on the trade side against countries like Singapore are vital as kind of a straddling country, but also within the summit process. Again, Richard and I have worked many years ago on middle powers. And of course, here, the classic middle powers, Canada, Australia. But we're going to have different sort of middle powers. And here was probably even a country like Italy. We don't really associate Italy with being a middle power, but with Draghi, with the sense of kind of having good relations with the United States and good relationships with China, we're going to have a very interesting perspective about Italian diplomacy. And of course here, and I'll get to this as my final theme about the G20, we see by kind of serendipity, Italy hosting the G20 this year. You're going to see the straddling component even into other institutions. And here BRICS is a good example. I did a small book for the Oxford very short introduction series on the BRICS, fascinating topic. The BRICS has evolved, but of course, rather than just seeing it as a construct of China and India as the biggest countries, we're going to be looking at countries that can straddle between India and China. And here, it's probably Brazil isn't in the best situation to be able to do this, but maybe South Africa is. South Africa is kind of the lucky country in that sense, belonging to so many different institutions, still having good bureaucrats, still having a sense of responsible sort of good citizenship and so on. And this, I think, it's going to be difficult for South Africa. But when we see President being invited back to the G7, but also, of course, being a BRICS member, there's lots of space for diplomacy for a country like South Africa. And finally, talking about straddlers, the main straddling institution that we have, and here is the G20. But probably the G20 hasn't had the best COVID. This is, I think, due to a number of issues. One, of course, is the Trump effect. Trump, kind of diminished some of these meetings by kind of making it into a circus. Certainly, there's a sense of polarization. China, Russia, United States, etc. But there's also kind of situational problems. Virtual meetings in G20 aren't the best. And of course, having Saudi Arabia, not the most experienced or the most kind of diffuse country in terms of being engaged with a lot of different issues in the world, in global affairs, makes it very hard. But at the same time, if you look back at the G20, even on climate change, we can see one of the major breakthroughs for climate change was done on the side of APEC. Back in November 2014, the meeting between President Obama, President Xi, and sort of driving this sort of momentum, the ricochet effect of diplomacy through back into the COP process. So maybe this will happen even in health. I'll leave Clare to being the expert in that area. But again, having had work in a think tank, and again, Richard knows this well before the global financial crisis, we did a number of workshops in 2002, 3, 4, 5, trying to figure out what would be the recipe, what would be the catalyst for a global summit like the G20. And the issue that always came up was health, that there would be some sort of pandemic, that leaders would say, we need some sort of global summit reprocess that brings together the major countries of the world to deal with that. So I'm hoping for that. The last word, of course, and Amitav, I haven't seen him yet, but of course we come back to the idea of multilateralism not meaning multiple. In some ways, it's quite the opposite in terms of diplomacy. We see sort of more restrictiveness, more exclusion in terms of the diplomatic process. So if we take Amitav's view that there's a sort of multiplex, you have to kind of pay to get into the multiplex, or in Canada, the cineplex. It is not going to be open to everybody. And we see this with multilateralism. The hopes and the aspirations that somehow multilateralism meant a pluralism of all sorts of different actors still there on the side and on some of the domains, but this is not the center game. It's not the main game of multilateralism as we move forward. So thanks again for the invitation, and I'll wait for questions.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Let's move straight on to Clare Wenham, who's Assistant Professor at the London School of Economics. Thank you, Clare. Over to you.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you for the invitation to be on this panel this afternoon. I'm very delighted to be here. So I was asked to talk a bit about global health diplomacy and what we've learned about multilateralism and diplomatic efforts in the context, I guess, of COVID, but maybe before that as well. And actually, I just wanted to start by, I don't think I've ever been called a revisionist before, but probably I am. And then, but it sort of depends on what day you ask me.
Sorry,
Richard.
I should have said reformist.
Reformist, no, fine. But I think actually, on the low days, the days where I'm more skeptical, I think maybe I'm a kind of status quo kind of person, and just like nothing is going to change, and I kind of facilitate between those two things. But I'll come on to that as I start talking. So as Andrew had discussed, this idea of pandemics had been on the radar of multilateral institutions like the WHO, the World Bank, but also amongst many, national security councils and national security strategies of many leading governments across the world for many years. And there was always this rumoring that, something's going to happen. There's going to be a big epidemic or pandemic that's going to require collective action. It's going to require everyone working together. And really what we had a kind of warning shot of this with SARS in 2002 and 2003. And this kind of sent those real world shockwaves around particularly developed countries that was like, we need to do something because this could happen. And this could have, an outbreak in China can have major global effects, mainly, but not just on people's health, but on economic stability and regional stability. And this has then led over the last 20 years or so to a kind of normative shift around the way we think about pandemics and the way governments are working to try and protect against pandemics. So we talk about kind of preventing, detecting, and responding to epidemics. And these sort of norms of global health security and reframing health to be a security issue to try and get it up the agenda, up the political agenda, to get action around trying to mitigate potential future events. This was then codified as some of the formal things that Andrew mentioned, codified in international law in 2005 with the International Health Regulations, which was, a legally binding piece of international law through the WHO, ready to, detect an outbreak, tell governments what they needed to do, and, hope it would never become a major pandemic. And this was more or less working as the kind of diplomatic effort for multilateralism coordinated through the WHO up until COVID. I mean, there'd been a few wobbles with Ebola where there was criticism people didn't do enough soon enough, but more or less it was going. And then basically COVID has been this, straw that broke the camel's back. And, there's no reason when we look at COVID, there's absolutely no reason in my mind why COVID became as bad as it did, other than a failure of political governance, a failure of multilateralism, and a failure of global health governance. Because we could have clamped down early and not let it become this real global phenomenon, which we now can't contain. And so really it talks to this kind of failure of multilateralism and this failure of these norms and law of global health governance that we've got so far. And what we saw was, instead of working on this kind of these sort of glib statements which have been thrown around for the last 20 years of we're only as strong as the weakest link, and an outbreak anywhere is a risk to everywhere, that all kind of crumbled down when governments decided to basically depart from multilateral efforts, depart from what WHO said, and chart their own paths about how they were going to respond to this pandemic. And we've seen this relatively universally, that governments have, to a more or less extent, rejected WHO guidance on how best to respond to this. Now, obviously, we have no control as to know what would have happened had everyone followed WHO advice, right? And what would have happened had everyone followed the advice? Would we still be in the situation or not? We don't know that for sure. But we do know that to get out of this, we need to have, some form of working together globally, right? There needs to be some form of unified vision to try and get out of this. And, we're only going to get out of this pandemic once enough jabs are put in enough arms around the world, effectively. And how long that takes is going to dictate how much longer this pandemic goes on for. And so we're kind of caught in this cusp of, a pandemic which has been caused by a failure of multilateralism, but now needing multilateralism to get out of it. And given the lack of confidence that's been shown towards multilateral institutions, it leaves us in a difficult position. We've got WHO, which is, it's been almost sidelined in this response. We've got efforts like COVAX, which I'm going to come on to talk about, which have basically not really worked, because a donation model is never going to work when it's based on norms of solidarity and cooperation, which governments aren't willing to show. And then we had the G7 last week. And, Boris Johnson said this, he was going to take big strides at the G7 to priority number one, end this pandemic and get it over with. Now, quite a damning, we've seen the G7 be a location for diplomatic efforts previously for managing health crises. So don't forget that in 2000, we had the G8 then set up the Global Fund for HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. A huge commitment which has revolutionized the way we respond to, or at least the governance of how we respond to those three diseases. We've had the Moscow Initiative in 2010, which was another key moment in global health policy, as it was when we saw huge increases in commitments to responding to HIV and TB and maternal health. And so the G7 has precedent for making big commitments and making things happen in global health. But a quite damning editorial came out of the BMJ at the weekend, the British Medical Journal, basically saying that the G7 in Carbis Bay was a complete failure. They put it that the G7 said, we came, we saw, and we said, not us. Because what the G7 agreed to last week was nothing short of underwhelming in how we are thinking about responding to the pandemic. There were very few concrete actions that they put in place. For example, they sort of said, we need to strengthen WHO. But it was the same institute, it was the same governments that departed from WHO guidance at the peak of the crisis. So does anyone believe they're going to strengthen WHO? Also, it's very easy to say, let's strengthen an institution without actually doing anything about it, right? Are we going to see meaningful commitments to financing? Are they going to start following the policies that are coming out of it? We also saw this big issue of not enough vaccines, right? We know we're going to get out of this with vaccines. Now, the G7 basically upped their total contribution of vaccines to 2 billion, and that includes what's already been committed by these institutions, by these governments. Now, we need, there's 8 billion people in the world. We need 16 billion doses. they've committed 2 billion. It's still nowhere near enough. And we know that the COVAX model, based on voluntary donations and not on meaningful sharing of the IP waiver and meaningful tech transfer to be able to facilitate domestic production and basically ramp up the production capacity, is going to take a long time, right? Effectively, it's saying we're going to be in this for a lot longer than we need to be if we're willing to do that. But we see this tension of diplomacy almost being held up by, patent protection and the pharmaceutical lobby, which I think is a real weakness. And my guess is, we'll look back at the G7 in 2021 and say they're on the wrong side of history on this one, and it was a failure of diplomatic efforts. And that leads us, in my last couple of minutes, to think about, well, what's next? Now, the G7, as well as the EU, who proposed this, and the WHO, have now suggested that the way to stop this ever happening again and to make sure we never get into a situation where we're living with again is to have a pandemic treaty. And this treaty is going to be the solution to everything. It's going to be rooted in global solidarity, in shared norms, shared vulnerability, and cooperation for helping each other out to prevent future pandemics. They talk about improving surveillance and improving detection and improving lab capacity and having vaccine distribution pre-agreed. But effectively what they have, what they're proposing already exists, right? It already exists in other forms of policy, in other forms of law. What they're suggesting is they're going to bring this political commitment to meet it. But ultimately, I don't understand why our current leaders think that future leaders are going to act any differently to how they have, right? It's a classic IR problem of how do you get governments to do something, in the collective when it's not necessarily in their national interest. And I don't understand how we're going to get from this point of governments didn't follow collective action problems, they didn't work multilaterally, to changing that in the future. And so what I see in this pandemic treaty is it's going to go one of three ways. And I think it's almost, well, there's certainly a lot of weight behind it from a lot of the key diplomatic actors in the global health space, the EU, WHO, the UK government, there's a bunch of other governments who are keen for it. The US is currently sitting on the fence about it. We've also got governments actively pushing against it. Places like India, for example, who've said, well, you've not shown any norms of solidarity during this pandemic. So why do we think you're going to show them if we have a treaty? It doesn't make any sense to them. So I think either it's going to die a death, governments aren't going to want it, the US isn't going to want it, and that's going to mean that it never happens. And so we're left with the same status quo of kind of nothing really changing. Or this treaty might be developed but not ratified, or ratified in different ways. So they're talking about a model based on the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control and sort of a Framework Convention model whereby governments can then choose which parts of it they wish to ratify. Now, obviously, that's a fundamental flaw when you need governments to ratify all parts of it, so that we, have, good sharing of data and good, transparency of processes. It just seems like it's never going to work. Or in the negotiation processes and the diplomatic processes that happen starting in November, when it's going to get, we're going to have a first World Health Assembly special session to try and negotiate it, is it's going to become so bland and vanilla that it's not going to have any power. And therefore governments are going to ignore it, just like they've ignored all the international law and policy over the last couple of years. So actually, I see this as quite an interesting time for studying diplomacy and studying multilateralism in global health. But whether I'm a reformist or a status quo, we'll have to see what happens in the next couple of years. But unfortunately, I fear, given the G7's tendencies in the last week, I can't see anything fundamentally changing, which is sad for the world of global health, but might give us a much better insight into IR and diplomacy.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was actually very interesting, but let me just comment that when I think of you as a reformist, I was basically thinking of you in the positive sense of someone who knows what needs to be done, rather than someone who is looking for some kind of apocalyptic outcome or no change whatsoever. But clearly, as an analyst, you are, and I think quite correctly, you're saying don't expect too much movement on this front. And I think what will be interesting in our discussions is to hear you and Andy on this particular issue in a multilateral context. Okay, let me move on then to Mills. Mills Soko, who is a professor in the Witwatersrand Business School, who is going to, I gave him a brief, but I told him he was free to speak about what he wanted to speak about anyway. But I hope that he's going to look at some of the regional dimensions, and particularly some of the African dimensions of what we might call the multilateral diplomatic agenda. And particularly, I was hoping he might say something about Chinese initiatives in Africa as well. So without tying you to any of that, Mills, please, the floor is, I was going to say the floor is yours. The screen is yours, Mills. Mills?
All right. Thank you very much, Richard. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Did you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I can hear you. You know, I'm in transit, so I'm having some connection problems, but hopefully these will be resolved. Before I talk about the brief that you gave me, which is about the growing competition between China and the United States and how this plays out on the African continent, I just wanted to make a comment which echoes what Clare has said about COVAX. From the African perspective, and specifically from the South African perspective, we have made the determination that it has been a complete failure. It's been an abject failure. And what Clare did not mention is the role of vaccine nationalism in this, and also the predatory behavior of pharmaceutical companies, which have browbeaten developing country governments into paying, for drugs, at a very, very steep prices. So I want to underline that point, that what this has underscored, this experience of COVID-19, is that there are asymmetries of power and capabilities that trump global cooperation and multilateral solutions to combating health challenges. I think if there's anything for me to take out of this is that, power dynamics have been at the forefront of this struggle against COVID. Power dynamics represented both by pharmaceutical companies as well as developed country governments, which have used their vaccine acquisition strategies to stockpile vaccines at the expense of developing and, most importantly, least developed countries. So I think that point, that's a point I wanted to make, Richard. Very briefly, I want to talk about the growing rivalry between the US and China and how this plays out in Africa. And the central point I want to make is that, from the African perspective, this is good, because it provides opportunities for the continent, to realize its positive agency and to chart its own future. These tensions between China and the US, they have a very striking resemblance to the tensions that existed between the US and the Soviet bloc during the Cold War years. And the problem is that if African countries are not, careful enough, they might end up making the kinds of mistakes that they made in the, during the Cold War era. So the point I'm making here is that it's important for African countries to seize the opportunities created by these tensions between the US and China, to advance their own interests. Now, to illuminate my point, I want to focus on three areas. Firstly, technological frontiers. and secondly, global supply chains, and thirdly, trade integration and economic cooperation. But before I come to that, I want to make the point that, in the context of these, the rising geopolitical tensions between the US and China, African countries may find themselves making the same mistakes that they made in the past. We have seen, in recent years, the tensions manifesting themselves in a vicious trade war between the two countries, at least under the Trump administration. And this has compounded a situation that has been characterized by a economic recession, as well as the impact of COVID-19 in Africa. So the point I'm making is that African leaders need to consciously design strategies, right, of engagement that will ensure that they manage the ongoing superpower tensions to their advantage. Now, let me then move on to how they could do this in respect of the three areas that I've identified: technological frontiers, global supply chains, and trade integration. I'll briefly discuss these in turn. There is overwhelming evidence that technological innovation is a key driver of economic growth. Therefore, access to and exploitation of new technologies such as 5G is vital to Africa's development. Fifth generation technologies are important options for a continent like Africa, where mobile technology has leapfrogged more traditional technologies. Access to technologies like 5G offers access to universal broadband, which is critical for the continent to advance to a digital economy. Now, in May 2019, the government of the United States, the US government, put the Chinese firm Huawei, the world's biggest supplier of 5G network infrastructure, on its list of entities deemed to pose a significant risk to national security and foreign policy interests of the United States. Huawei was effectively banned from importing and incorporating key US technologies into its products and services. This included both hardware, such as high-tech semiconductor components, as well as software, such as Google Mobile Services. The ban was later extended to key technologies from non-US firms. So these included the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is a major Huawei supplier. Now, why is this important to Africa? Here in South Africa, in the month following the initial ban, which was imposed by the US, the CEOs of four major South African telecommunications companies, they wrote a letter to the President Cyril Ramaphosa, requesting him to urgently intervene on the US action against Huawei. They wanted him to use diplomatic channels to put pressure to safeguard South Africa's interests. And the reason for that is that South African companies, telecommunications companies, are heavily reliant on Huawei for the import of their components. So Ramaphosa, as president, was forced to make a statement in which he expressed support not only for the South African companies, but also for Huawei, which is a Chinese company. So he took a stance, in terms of these tensions between the US and China. He took a stance in favor of China. And this is something that was unthinkable, during the Cold War. And so my point that I'm making here, that this is an example of pragmatism on the part of the South African government. And I believe that it is something that African policy makers should strenuously safeguard and their right to choose from the widest possible range of technology options that suit their country's development needs. And they should insist on acquiring and developing new technologies like 5G based on pragmatism. I know that the US government has previously put a great deal of pressure on Western countries like Australia, like the UK, Germany, New Zealand, to not to allow Huawei to use its 5G infrastructure in these countries. But this for me is very important from the African perspective, that the president of South Africa took a very clear position on that. So that has to do with technological frontiers. Now, with respect to global supply chains, we've seen how the global pandemic, and the attendant economic crisis led to the collapse of global markets, and that had a huge impact on export markets of many African countries for agricultural products, for other primary products, for tourism. That is a huge economic impact. Now, these tensions between the US and China, they revolve largely around technology and trade, right, and supply chains. And this is having a huge impact on the African continent, because a lot of African countries are heavily reliant on global supply chains. And we know that the global supply chains in many respects are located in specific economic regions, and they are largely centered around China. So that had a very huge implications for African countries. But I think what they've also done is to open up opportunities that African countries, in my view, should exploit. They've exposed serious problems in supply networks across various sectors, including digital products, food, pharmaceutical, as well as medical supply chains. But they also represent opportunities for African countries to develop new products, services, and capabilities. They could, in my view, for example, African countries use this to address certain
I think Mills lost his connection.
Yes, I think you're correct. As it turns out, we now have Amitav, who lost his earlier connection. Hello, Amitav. Nice to see you.
I really apologize for that. I'm in my newer house, not in my original house. We are having a break, and the connection here, air conditioning, all broke down. So, but I'm available to talk.
No sympathy over the air conditioning, Amitav. Okay, well, look, since Mills, are you back with us?
Yeah, Richard, I'm struggling. I don't know if how I should proceed. Where I am, the connectivity is very. Do
you want to make
unstable.
one last point and then we stop?
Okay, so the last point had to do with intra-Africa trade. So these technological frontiers, global supply chains, and in intra-Africa trade. And I think what the tensions between the US and China provide, they provide African countries with the opportunity to deepen trade integration and economic cooperation. African countries realize more and more that they cannot rely on external trade partners such as China and the US and Europe for their trade. And this global COVID, the crisis has really amplified that. And so this makes the imperative of trade, intra-Africa trade and trade integration very, very urgent. So when you look at intra-African trade, currently it accounts for 16% of total African trade, and that is compares unfavorably with other regions, for instance, like Asia, where it's 52%, and Europe, where it's 73%. So the African Continental Free Trade Area represents a very important opportunity for African countries to to broaden and to expand trade amongst each other, and I think that it's in a.
Okay. You've gone again. Okay, thanks, Mills. If you can hear me, what I think we should do is move to Amitav. So, for those members of the audience, let me bring to the screen Amitav Acharya, who's a distinguished professor at the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. And I'm glad he's been able to make it. So, Amitav, from your idyllic riverside position, speak to us.
Thank you very much. And I sincerely apologize for not being able to do my presentation what I was supposed to do. I am in a new place, as you can see. It's not in the city area, we had some connectivity problems. But I'm glad to be here and to share my thoughts on this very important topic. And in the 9 minutes I have. But let me start by posing the question, what do we mean by reset? I mean, there are other terms starting with re that one can also consider, and such as, people, it's very fashionable to talk about rebooting. So, instead of resetting, rebooting, like when you have a new versions of old films, like, or sitcoms like Cheers or Star Trek, people talk about reboot, and that is really different from the classic Star Trek, for example, to give you one example. So rebooting is often considered to be something that is really different from the original version, but still within the same parameters, same broad themes, and like Star Trek, exploring the space with similar characters. But there's also the thing about reform. And when you talk about a multilateral system, the term that the emerging powers use is reform of the multilateral system. I mean, Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India, just at the G7 summit, he couldn't come in person, but virtually he talked again about reforming. They don't use the term resetting or rebooting or overthrowing the multilateral system. The Chinese also talk about reform. And that is probably a little less radical than rebooting or resetting. So my concern, my main sort of point is that how much change we need to have in the multilateral system, which will address the problems of the day, and which are different from the problems of 20 years ago, and certainly different from the problems of the late 19th century, early 20th century, or immediately after World War II. So how much change could address those problems, the new problems, while still not creating too much disruption? Because as you know, it is very difficult, as Bob Cohen, one of the political scientists who has written a great deal on multilateralism, said, it's much easier to reform or modify multilateral institutions than create new ones. So in his view, in that sense, when people talk about reinventing multilateralism or changing the liberal order, destroying the liberal order, the argument is that it's much easier to reform existing institutions than creating new ones. So within that context, I take the view that I think simple reform may sound good, but I think it's not going to be enough. We need to have some amount of disruption. In one of my books on global governance, I have talked about creative fragmentation, like Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction. We know that the multilateral system has been fragmenting. The big multilaterals of the post-war system, which were created under American hegemony leadership, are no longer the only game in town. Issue areas proliferate. Multilateralism kind of started initially with a strong focus on security, collective security, and economic development trade like IMF, World Bank, the Bretton Woods institution. But since then, a whole range of issue areas have crept in. And climate change, look at the status of climate change today relative to 1950s and 60s. Even trade, we didn't have a World Trade Organization. We had GATT, and that WTO came in. So the issues that we have today are far more transnational, meaning they don't respect national boundaries if they ever did. They sometimes come in very short notice, and they are really not amenable to solutions by any one country, or two countries, no matter how big and powerful. So in that, and also we have the global power shift. China and India, they are a share of the GDP in the world were like less than 10%, less than about 5% collectively in 1945, compared to over 35% in the 18th century. And now they're moving, and China, second largest economy, India has overtaken. I tweeted about this during the Biden-Putin summit, that Russia's GDP is $1 trillion less than India's. But Russia gets the platform edge summit, as if the Cold War never ended. Or for that matter, India's GDP overtook that of UK, its former colonial master, in 2019. So that's some striking examples of why we need to think beyond. I'm not saying that we should give a special place to India and China, but I also think that has a lot of problems. I've written about the hype of the rest, so to speak. But I think the idea is that we need to think beyond reform and do something more disruptive, but creatively in that sense. So then the next question is, where do you get the ideas for this reform? I like a lot of you, I am also a student of multilateralism. I've been participating in meetings, looking at various reports from various think tanks, including some of where the panelists are involved in. And I find that a lot of these ideas, they're excellent ideas. There are a lot of very good ideas of how to change and reform the multilateral system. But I think in some ways they're working within the system, within the existing structure. My late former colleague, Bob Cox, talked about problem solving in the Canadian versus critical theory. So problem solving is when we work within the existing international system. And critical is when you go beyond that system and do something really different. And he has had his own ideas about multilateralism involving more civil society, different types of actors. Professor Higgott has written recently about how to do network multilateralism, and I've been part of some of his these projects. But I think most of the reforms we have seen so far in the major think tanks, not individual scholars who are far ahead in their thinking and a little more radical in their thinking, but in the mainstream think tanks and intergovernmental forums are basically problem solving. They're tinkering. And I'm not dismissing them. And one has to be practical here. But I think we do need to get a set of new ideas and new ways of organizing. Now, multilateralism has a history of, not Concert of Europe, 200 years, but I would say 3,500 years. The first multilateral system, diplomatic system in the world was the Amarna diplomacy of the mid second millennium BC, Egypt and its neighbors. So it's not really a new concept. One of my new projects looks at the classical models of multilateralism and great power diplomacy. It's like a virtual Concert of Europe in the 15th century BC. But we don't have to even go there. There are other types of multilateralism in the Chinese political order in East Asia. It was not multilateral in the sense, actually it could have been multilateral. There have been events where several leaders or tributary missions were present at the same place. And other, in a very ironic sense, the colonial system had multilateral elements. So I think we need to look for new ideas that go beyond the present system of the UN. The UN collective security system has still relevance, but we need to really bring in ideas from other parts of the other civilizations and other cultures. And this is a real challenge. Their ideas are out there, but they're not very well known. One final point is about connectivity and technology. So this is one of the focuses of this panel. I was recently asked a question in another meeting that what to do with technology? Is technology going to change or affect the global power shift? Since the West still has a big lead in technology, and when you talk about technology haves and have-nots, what about the poor countries? How are they going to manage? Like, for example, with the pandemic, the technology of distance communication, like this Zoom, are they going to be left behind? And also, who is going to lead in that technology? So that reminded me of a term that Neil Ferguson talked about in his book, Civilization, where he said the only way the rest is catching up with the West is by downloading Western ideas, okay? So that's his term, downloading. And I had a debate with him in China in 2018, I think. And when I said the rest is not downloading, they're also not just downloading. They did that for a while, but that's not the only reason for the rise of the rest, so to speak. They're also uploading. And uploading means new technologies that are much more relevant to managing day-to-day governance, not the fancy space technology or military technology, but technology that is relevant to day-to-day global governance. Is actually a lot of this is and ideas related to that are also coming out of the non-West. And I gave a few examples of that. You can talk about China. China's popular technology like TikTok or WeChat being one of the examples, but there are others, and also making technology suitable to the context. What works in the United States may not work in India. I mean, I grew up in a time when we didn't have telephones, and within 10 years after my graduation from high school, India had one of the highest user population of mobile phones, for example. It just happened just before my eyes as I was growing up. But they did that not just simply buying technology from the outside, but developing technology by adapting foreign technology. And so I think technological gaps, especially when it comes to global governance, are I think a little overstated. I think, but we should be looking at what kind of technologies and what sort of pattern of technological diffusion will make global governance and multilateralism stronger. And there is as much as an issue of uploading here than the rest downloading from the West. So without further ado, due to lack of time, I can't elaborate on this, but I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Amitav. And that gives us time for some discussion. What's been really interesting is that the four of you have all taken a different perspective, but you've all had some core themes. And what I'd like to do is kind of try and pick on the core theme first. And I go back to Clare, who you didn't hear, Amitav, who gave us a very interesting presentation on the limits and constraints of multilateralism in dealing with COVID-19, with the pandemic, and particularly referring to the G7 meeting. Andy talked a bit about the G20. Mills has talked about various elements of trade integration. But one of the things that struck me, and this has been part of the book that I've just finished, is that there is no new big understanding, to use, if you like, Judd's idea of a community of destiny beyond the level of states as communities of origin. And so my question to all of you really is where, I mean, you kind of implied it, where does the next big idea come from? If you think about the post-World War II period, for whatever we thought about them, Bretton Woods, creation of the UN system, they were built on a set of normative assumptions and values, as well as on empirical agendas, as limited as they were. And it was argued that this was because of the fundamental nature of crisis. Is what's happened in the last 12 to 18 months, is the prospect of recurring global pandemic, is the prospect of climate change problems, are they sufficient catalysts for new thinking about how we may organize a community of destiny beyond the level of the state? Or are we destined to go back into some kind of nationalist, populist agenda where resilience is the euphemism that replaces nationalism and populism? Let's see, Andy, you've not said anything for a long time. You go first.
Well, in some ways, we'd like to look forward, but I'd say the last 2 weeks have either reinforced my view that in many ways we're going back. I mean, Clare commented on the SARS crisis. I mean, during that crisis, China showed a lot of flexibility about sovereignty. It kind of loosened up right after the first kind of crackdown about some of the whistleblowers. I mean, they loosened up about Taiwan. They loosened up about having experts come in and monitor and so on. We've seen a hardening of sovereignty. And of course, with the United States, despite the trips of Biden, we don't see much change in terms of the discourse about sovereignty. I mean, it's mostly on the border issues, but it radiates out. The other that's really problematic to me, and I think it's problematic to me in Clare's kind of treaty process, I think we're going back if we look at G7 as kind of the motor for kind of reforms in global governance. I mean, those days I think should and could be over. I mean, I think it's one thing for the G7 to mobilize themselves in terms of vaccines and so on. It's another thing to kind of say that the G7 is a consortium for the world, you know, that in some ways they dictate, you know, to China about various human rights issues and so on. In that regard, even though I disagree with Kishore on a lot of other things, I would agree with Kishore on that. I mean, it might not be a circus, but it certainly doesn't have legitimacy in terms of, at the least, it has a certain modicum of efficiency or could have. So certainly, I think we have to kind of look at the problems of going back before we start looking at the creative issues going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kishore's point, I mean, the expression he used was, who do they think they are? Yeah. The G7, speaking to the other, I've got to get this right, the other 88% of the world.
Exactly.
Claire, do you...
I've attended a few G7s and G8s, and I mean, the expulsion of Russia just kind of consolidates that, you know, there's a virtue of being like-minded. I mean, at times the G7, G8 wasn't like-minded. During 2003, the Iraq invasion, certainly there was lots of fraction, but at the same time, it's kind of reverted to that like-mindedness, a clubbishness. I mean, and there's certainly attractions to that. But again, the idea that G7 can kind of position itself kind of to dictate or to kind of have normative superiority is really problematic. So I think we either have to go to a wider kind of forum that's state-based, or we, you know, as Richard has commented, in more of a network multilateralism and have a diffusion of states and all sorts of other creative forces around the world.
Claire.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree, Andrew, right? That, like, you know, who are the G7 and why should they, you know, they shouldn't necessarily be the central decision making. However, in global health, for the last 30 years, it has been those governments that have been doing it. And they hold the purse strings effectively, right? They're the ones who have traditionally been funding all this global health activity. And if it's not them directly, it's organizations that are based in them. And I'm thinking of the Gates Foundation being the major one, which is the major contributor to most of global health activity. And they're very closely aligned with the Biden administration and kind of not pushing for TRIPS waivers and not pushing for tech transfer. And so you see this kind of bigger picture there. And then you think, well, what else could it look like? And I absolutely don't think it should be a Western-centric activity. And I absolutely think we should be having a much more representative activity. But where we have representation is in the WHO. It's one state, one vote, right? And traditionally, Western states haven't used that mechanism for global health activity because they prefer to use Bretton Woods institutions where they have more power and decision-making power at the table. But when we see the WHO getting sidelined, we see these new structures developing, these new governance structures developing, which almost supersede it. And I don't see how other states get a look in that actually gets taken seriously. And I think that's the crux of it, is that I would love to exist in a global health policy world where it wasn't dictated by the people who met in Cornwall last week, plus Bill Gates. But it's sort of, I don't know how you get around that. And I would be all ears to think of it. And there's been much discussion about how to, for example, reform the WHO to make it more inclusive, and how to reform global health to, decolonize and efforts like this. But fundamentally, as I always tell my students when we talk about WHO, when you rebuild it, if you knock down the system and start again, you end up with something which looks just like the WHO, right? And it's a kind of, catch-22 that we all know the flaws of it, but no one can really push through the changes, or certainly no one has been able to thus far.
Amitav, can you hear me? Amitav? It looks like we've lost Amitav and we've lost Mills. It's Friday afternoon. So
I'm here.
Amitav,
Good, okay.
Good.
Sorry, I just wanted to say probably not the right time to use the term like community of destiny. This kind of reminds me of when in East Asia we talk about East Asian community, and the Chinese also talk about community of.
Mankind.
Probably we should be careful about the language, because you're talking about a lot more serious things, and this language sometimes can obscure the seriousness of what we're talking about. There is always going to be a tension between the desire for a community and the realpolitik. And at this point, the world is in a more realpolitik mode. And even the language of community of destiny could be misconstrued. Even if your ideas are, some of them are very practical and needs to be pursued. But beyond that, talking about global health and the US, sitting in Washington, following in the G7 summit and all the various things, NATO summit, European Union, US summit, the so-called New Atlantic Charter. Can you be more arrogant than that?
Yeah.
I think you have to understand that this is a very tactical move by the Biden administration to signal to the world and to American domestic politics, to the anti-Trump, the US is back. It has nothing to do with, as far less to do with what will be US long-term policy towards other multilateral institutions, G20, or even US vaccine. Look at US vaccine diplomacy. There are multiple channels. Not all of it is through G7. There is an idea to have this quad vaccine manufacturing to it, India and Australia and Japan and US. There is also US direct help to, US has got back to WHO. US is working with COVAX directly and bilaterally. So the G7, which is the media did a shameful, terrible job. In fact, it's time to switch off on CNN and all this, especially the American version of CNN. They just hyped it. But what the Biden administration is doing, and I happen to actually know Jack Sullivan because I invited him to my class when he was out of office. Their thinking is actually G20. They understand that the world is moving beyond the West, much more so than Trump and others. But they have to tell, this is the first international trip of Biden, first international show. So they wanted to, first of all, rebuild some of the damage Trump had done. So reassure their friends. And this is generally a signal to everywhere. It just happened that this thing came up first. but also to tell the domestic audience that we are past Trump. Trump is just the other guy. So let's not make too much out of what happened in this G7. It doesn't really mean that other types of U.S. initiatives, other multilateral forums will be neglected. That's what I wanted to say. Otherwise, I do agree about global health and other points, but let's be careful about jumping into conclusions about U.S. policy.
That's a good point, because my last we have to close in a couple of minutes. My last mischievous question was going to be, is Joe Biden part of the problem or part of the solution? And I had exactly the same view of the Atlantic Charter, the arrogance of the Atlantic Charter, the idea of an Atlantic Charter in 2021. And while everyone can see the virtues of Joe Biden, if you think about he's not future forward tense looking. And I just wondered how much prioritizing the G7, prioritizing the Atlantic Charter, prioritizing the notion of the democracies, it will turn out to be counterproductive rather than productive. Andy, what do you think about that?
Well, I agree with you and Amitav in the sense that we have to look at the constellation of institutions. I mean, we see kind of the Atlantic foray now, but the Indo-Pacific is a fascinating process. I mean, you see debates among individual countries. I was reading about Bangladesh. There's a debate going on about whether they would be invited into the Indo-Pacific. I mean, the question, of course, is a normative one. I mean, how can you make a judgment about democracies? I mean, who passes the test, who doesn't pass the test? And of course, we know that the United States will be the judge of the test. On that basis, I think we go back to the G20. And I mean, Claire's point is accurate, but it was probably the Gates Foundation penetrated the G20 far more than it penetrated the G7. I mean, going back, the French were the ones that championed the Gates Foundation on tax reform. So again, there's a whole constellation of kind of clubs and networks that we have to look forward to. I think the future is a fake one in terms of looking towards sort of a wider democratic kind of initiative of the future. I think it's going back to try to cobble together some sort of constellation of, if we don't call them the rest, at least it is the G7 plus the BRICS plus kind of these loose MICTA countries, whatever you kind of call them. I mean, this is about as good as we've got, including kind of the outreach to countries like Singapore and others. So I think this is probably still the best hope for global governance, as limited as it is.
Okay, thanks. I'm afraid, tragically, that we've got to close there. And so it's my duty basically to, I'm sorry we lost Mills again at the end. I suppose we've got to hope that Huawei actually improves South Africa's connectivity over the next few years. But I thought we had the seeds of an extremely interesting conversation going and some good insights on a range of different topics. So Clare, Andy, Amitav and Andy, it's always lovely to see you, my old friends. Nice to meet you, Clare. To the audience that have stuck through with us to the end of this workshop, let me say thank you very much for your participation. I hope you found it rewarding. Julia and I will actually produce a document, a report on the back of the 2 days of the workshop, and we will make sure that everybody who registered for the workshop gets a copy of it. Julia, is there anything that you want to say? I understand that these will be going on YouTube sooner rather than later, but you might want to say something else, even if it's only farewell and thank you. I should say before we go to those who are listening, Jess and Julia and Sarah have been fantastic. So, Julia.
Yeah, I just want to take this opportunity to thank everybody once again, all the speakers, also all the participants who stayed with us for 2 days. It's not very common now with the online events to have events that are so long. So thank you very much for staying with us and for interacting. We will indeed publish the different session on YouTube, so you will have the